G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic start to your week. Now the big news that will affect this war is of course Mr. Donald Trump, or President-elect Donald Trump, becoming the President of the United States of America. Now depending when you're seeing this video, he's either going to be in or out, but the time zone difference, either way, next time I see you, he will be the President of the United States. And of course, we know what he has said about this war. He wants to end this war. He's originally said he'll end it within 24 hours, but I think he was just speaking in that, like saying, well, if I had $1 million, and we've seen more of his team suggest within about 6 months. But again, we will see, and we've gone over all of this in length around, well, what would Putin put on the table that would be acceptable to a US administration at this point? Of course, the US admin, they have put Ukraine as one of the US's most strong allies. They have pumped hundreds of billions of dollars into this. And on the other side, though, is Putin has pumped in billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of troops. So he will want to walk away seeming a victory back to his population as well. And with Putin objectively having the upper hand at the moment, what is he going to be happy with that Trump could actually accept as the leader of the US, and of course with President Zelensky here as well of Ukraine? Of course, US and all Ukraine's allies have said that no decision will be made without Ukraine at the table. But at the end of the day, the United States can force Ukraine's hand in any of these discussions, rightfully or wrongfully. It is just the way it is when you are completely reliant on an international partner for all of your military aid, a lot of your training, down to salaries, down to sale of resources, absolutely everything here. So tomorrow we'll give a bit of an update on that, and we'll keep up with that story as we go. But of course, today, we don't actually have as much as some other days to go over, so this video hopefully will be a little bit shorter. So of course we will look at the maps. Now the piece we really need to talk about is Velyka, Novosilka. Now I'm sure, unless you've been living under a rock and not watching my videos, well, I'm sure you'll know where this area is. The problem is it does look like a large contingent of Ukrainian forces may be strategically surrounded or getting very close to that. And we have spoken about before that Ukraine have acute manpower shortages. They cannot afford to lose a large amount of soldiers like that. It could spell disaster, and it could spell really the end of military fighting, or the ability to hold back too. Because if this got cut off, whether they were KIA or captured POW, if you're not going to then have that amount of soldiers there that can go to other areas of the front line, it could be a disaster. So we'll look over the maps, we'll look over other areas. I'll show you some footage and all of this. The, of course, General of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, then Kursk, will go over what he has said. He's talked about the situation. We'll look at what Anthony Blinken has said and what he did say back, and look back in time a little bit, of course, underneath President Biden. So let's jump onto the maps and show you a couple of things. So, of course, here is Ukraine in the center of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, the red check that you are going to see is territory that Russia is occupying over the last 24 hours. The blue check you'll see on this today is what ground Ukraine has either made back, but in this case, ground that Ukraine is further occupying in Kursk Oblast. And I'll show you that once we make our way up there. But there are a few changes on this map today, and Deep State is reporting this. So you can see where the Ukrainian Defense Forces have regained positions and where the Russians have advanced also, seen to by that check. But let's just move down right away before I lose where we are talking about, and we'll have a look at where there are some changes on this map. So if we just go forward and backwards, you can see down the Kurakhove front, we can see now Slovianka, the Russia has made an advancement from here, leaving this as a bit of a pocket between Yasnovi, Zoria, and then Slovianka as well, with multiple pockets developing around, of course, the Kurakhove front. line. So if we come down into the Kurakhove pocket here, we'll step back to yesterday, but have a look at Zelenivkia. So we can see that the grey zone has expanded and that Russia has reduced the amount of control around this sector by Ukrainian counter actions, at least being shown on this map. That's what I had the deep state open for, to remind myself of this. But if we then look on the Suryak maps, and we're talking about the Kurakhove pocket, so this is Dashny, this dot right in here, and you can see where this waterway is running. You can see where the deep state, of course, just to the east of Zelenivkia, is actually showing the Russians control more than Suryak is showing, but Suryak is showing this further advancement to the north in this sector. But where I want to go next, before we look at Pokrovsk, before we look at other areas, is step back to yesterday and see this major advancement that the Russian forces had around Velyka, Novosilka. Now, this is a major area. This is very strategically important area as well. Now, the messaging around the strategic importance of this is probably going to change in the coming days, but this is very important. Of course, this was one of the areas where Ukraine launched the 2023 counter-offensive that has now been turned back in these areas. But from Novaya Koma, Vremenka, further expansion and further then envelopment of this area too. The biggest issue here, and one of the biggest differences between this becoming enveloped to other areas like, say, Avdiivka or Seladov, is this river running through here. This creates a nightmare for withdrawals. And what did I show you, 2 or 3 days ago, was a number of Ukrainian vehicles getting hit by Russian drones out in this sector. And Velyka Novosilka, this is a very, very dangerous area. And if Ukraine was to have an amount of forces, a substantial amount of forces, then get fully enveloped in here and have to surrender, this could be absolutely disastrous, as we know there already are acute manpower shortages. So we'll look over some maps and we'll look over some footage, as well as what some Ukrainian pages are saying about this. For all intents and purposes, the Suryak map is showing very, very similar to what the deep state map is showing, so we can confirm this. Actually, while we're on the maps, let's look at another Ukrainian source. Of course, Mr. Noel reports. These are not particularly new gains, but an update over the last few days. Velyka Novosilka is surrounded with no real way out besides river crossings. It is unclear whether the AFU, the Armed Force of Ukraine, garrison is still present, and he's showing where these gains are on all three sides. But of course, we have got to cross a river to get out of here, and saying that it is surrounded, that this is developing and has deteriorated fairly quickly, but is a very important area that we need to be looking at the moment. Is the garrison still here? Well, it would be, otherwise it would have fallen very, very quickly. So we'll keep an eye on exactly what is happening here, but this could be a real turning point at the moment, of course, for down in the south, if not the war in itself, especially with how many reinforcements are here. Will there be counterattacks to try and get the forces out of here? What will we see? One thing we see time and time again is Ukraine leaving very, very late once enveloped, from areas from Mariupol, the Bakhmut, to everywhere in between. This is from a Ukrainian page saying here, to the direction of Velyka Novosilka. Well, as expected, our command reached the last. It's not scary to be afraid of responsibility when you are openly indignant. The main thing is that those who create such shit like boilers, forcing our Cossacks to die there, sit there for life. How can you not see the problem, the threat? Where is the common sense? And one thing we see time and time again is the flanks being allowed to get then built by the Russian forces. The flanks get captured and then no withdrawing out to better positions. And you can see from Avdiivka to where the front line now, Pokrovsk, a number of 50 kilometers has gone through what were meant to be more advantageous positions, but withdrawing way too late. Most of those who manage this process do not realise that the army is not eternal. No one will come to replace it, because there will be no one to educate the growing soldiers. Again, what we say is, in attritional war, you need to look after guys at the front line, in second, third and front line then lines, because their experience needs to proliferate through the ranks. If you have a force drop below 70% strength, or you're posting guys out, that experience does not proliferate. It doesn't matter what training that you have had. At the moment, the enemy controls the northeastern and southern parts of the village. The corridor to the north remains. Remember, I said that this is the only way you can get out with difficulty. So there have already been attempts to cross the river. Do you think everyone is getting out? The enemy persistently set tasks to take the village in the near future. And we will see, will Russia push to try and actually envelop this, or if they've got really good observation and drones to strike fleeing elements out of here, may leave it open and create a killing field in here. And we see that there is definitely a lot of drones operating in here. And we can see from an FPV drone here, looking to strike a Ukrainian armoured vehicle, but gets snaked by another Russian drone in here. And then you can see that it must have struck that this vehicle's on fire, and then a secondary strike in here. The reason I show that footage is just to show how saturated this whole area is by drones. From the footage I showed you of that tank, that got taken out right about where my cursor is here, if my memory is correct, that this is an area which is deteriorating very, very quickly and could really change the course over the next weeks or months, depending on how this becomes over the next few weeks. So wait out on that. Let's step back up to today. We know where there are some changes. We'll jump to Pokrovsk. No changes being shown on this map today, but I do have a couple of pieces to show you. So we'll talk around this Udashny front. Now, Udashny, very important, because if Udashny comes under Russian control, which of course are already in the outer eastern areas, it is an open road all the way to Dnipro Oblast, talking only 5 kilometers. Some maps are saying significantly less than this. And what I say is, the way that Trump is a transactional leader, if I was President Zelensky, the last thing I would want Russia doing is occupying a single inch of another oblast at this point in time. Let's look at the Syriac map here, and showing that towards Udashny and out to the north as well, Kotlene, that Russia has further expanded its control, but nothing too major on this front line. But Pokrovsk itself, there's a lot more footage today, and there has been more and more footage coming of FPV drones working inside Pokrovsk, and these are working everywhere in Pokrovsk at the moment. And then we have some footage here that just gives you an idea of the noise of the artillery, the multiple launch rocket systems, all this currently softening up Pokrovsk, ready for then further assaults in. Will we see Russia then build the flanks here, as they always do, envelop it and cause a withdrawal, or storm up the guts? Well, we will see. You can hear this here. But you can see that Russia is developing the flanks for Pokrovsk at the moment. Of course, Udashny front cutting off areas of supply, and out near Baranivkia as well. That works as two-pronged, because that works all the way up towards Chasiv Yar as well. So don't underestimate what is happening in here. That's what we're going to talk about next, is Chasiv Yar. No changes shown on this map today. We come in, and down to the south there is some control being shown by then the Syriac map as well. They've advanced here as well, and they're flanking the hospital, reaching these streets, and that Russian then sabotage reconnaissance groups are intensifying operations around the forest area down to the south of Chasiv Yar. Remember, Chasiv Yar again is a very important area too, and we know this by the resistance that is being pushed into here by the Ukrainian forces in an attempt to continue holding this. Now we'll come up just to the north of here, and you can see Terney Ivanivkia front. There has been a large expansion of control. If we go conservatively, say 2.2 kilometers from south of Ivanivkia, west of Terney, and this is being shown across the Syriac maps and some other maps such as Noel reports as well. Some of these are shown for a couple of days, but now we can confirm this movement, although Syriac map is showing a fair bit more control out to the south of here. But what we can say is that there was definitely movement in these directions. We'll continue up into the northeastern front, and Deep State is showing out from Dovnitchnia, the north of here, that Russia is continuing their expansion of control also. Now, we'll come up into the Kursk region. Of course, you've got Sumy on the Ukrainian side, Kursk on the Russian side, and you can see this Makovka here has been retaken by the Ukrainian forces. judging off the deep state Ukrainian map, some 2 kilometers, of course, to the southeast of Sudzha, a very important area because there's really 1 or 2 supply areas into this whole Kursk area that Ukraine is occupying at this point in time, that if that was to get cut off, if Sudzha itself, you're going to have guys hanging out to dry, although Kursk can be seen as that in many regards as well. You hear guys off the front line saying even the recovery of bodies is incredibly difficult, or even medevac. So let's have a look at where some things have developed on this map. Now, let's look at the Fab 3000s being used. So we can see Martinyovka, right where these then sheds are in here. We can see that the Russians have destroyed these by dropping a Fab 3000, of course, a 3-ton glide bomb on these sheds right in the center of your screen. And of course, you can also see that drones operating in this area, very large bangs, said to be an area for staging and logistics in those sheds. And you will see at the end here where these sheds have then been completely leveled. What was there or not, always impossible to know, but you could see why this could be an area for this, then heading out into the front line across these roads, of course, as the ground out here has got muddier and snowier as well, that you'll be looking to stick to the main roads and using what you can to then launch then attacks or resupply out of. We talk a lot about TOS, that the thermobaric weapons, short range, so Russia does struggle to bring them into the fold, but when we do see them take the risk to bring them into the fold, it is a key sign that they are about to storm that area, and it is the last bit of softening up before then movement in. And in Kursk, we then see right down in here. So the labeling is absolutely shocking on this map, but this area right in here, sorry, I don't know the exact town of what this is called, that Russia is employing TOS-1 thermobarics on this sector. And of course, these are incredibly efficient against fortifications, buildings, bunkers as well, just the way that thermobaric weapons work with the gas and then that igniting. That is legal to use, but many humanitarian groups have tried to push forward that thermobaric weapons would not be used, or also known as a vacuum bomb. So while we are on this area here, I'll show you then the Syriac maps. So it is showing right in this sector, very, very close to where I showed you those TOS landing, is Syriac saying where Ukraine had an advancement just in right in here. So this, where my cursor is where that advancement was, and TOS landing right around these areas. And of course, this is on some of the main areas of supply and logistics. And Syriac also showing just to the south of here. This is always difficult to see, but if we look where this road turns out and back, so just in this sector in here is where Russia took back some ground as well. So some fluidity occurring up in Kursk. That doesn't surprise us at all. So Kursk at this point sitting at 428 kilometer squares, and Ukraine hoping to use this as leverage if there is any negotiation process that Trump forces to the table. So let's go over some of the situation of the war. Now, we have seen said to be Iskander missiles then strike Kyiv overnight. Now, one thing I will say in this is we have seen, in my opinion, more of these missiles have actually successful strikes in areas, what could mean either an increase in the capability of these or a decrease in Ukraine's air defences as well. Of course, an Iskander is far more interceptable than something like a Kinzhal, and we're seeing that one of these strike in Kyiv. And there can be a few reasons for this. One, increasing the capability or the saturation of these, but potentially a decrease in air defense as well. And this is what many have said about specialists from the Air Force, both in fighter aircraft and in air defense, getting transferred into the infantry to try and backfill the acute manpower shortages that Ukraine has. So let's look at what Commander Sursky has said about this. The chief stressed that this order prohibits the transfer of highly qualified personnel who have undergone training and specialise in aircraft maintenance. Clearly, these are invested funds, specialists who have experience and are practically irreplaceable on the one hand. But on the other hand, we fundamentally need personnel at the front. We must maintain an adequate number of troops in our mechanised brigades. Unfortunately, mobilisation capabilities do not meet this need. And this is something that we have spoken about, is first and foremost, you need guys at the front. Exactly what Sursky is saying. in the infantry. Of course, the hardest, most deadly place to be. You're in the worst conditions and the most dangerous job. That is needed first, and specialists, as far as it's being reported, are being transferred for everything from aircraft maintenance through to air defences, and we could see a reduction in the capability of those air defences if that happens. People have also pointed to, if one of these guys gets captured and he has unique knowledge about the positioning and operation of those air defences, that could be very bad as well. According to him, the armed force of Ukraine is reasonably reducing the logistical component. So there definitely is some specialists or logistical soldiers then moving onto the front line. Therefore, the headquarters know these tasks. They have done the calculations. According to the news agency Ukrainska Pravda, citing sources reported on Jan 14, specialists from the Air Force were being massively transferred to the ground forces in 2024 and early 25 to reinforce combat brigades. And we've also seen videos of entire units talking about this happening as well. Guys who are in logistical roles, specialist roles off the front line being moved straight into infantry, untrained and ill-experienced. But not only that, but it's reducing the capability of what they provided as well. This is what acute manpower is, a snowball effect. Now, he's also said in the same interview, you can't win a war in defence. We must leverage our advantages. Ukraine was the first to create drone forces. We're expanding UAV capabilities, developing robotic platforms and ground combat systems. And what we have seen is that Ukraine has been in defence for at least the last 15 months. And you can't win a war, especially a war where you have territorial ambition, just in defence. At some point, Ukraine will need to go on the offensive action. They'll have to turn that tide. But what we have not seen, from manpower to physical resources entering in, is we have not seen large enough moves to actually swing the tide from defensive posturing onto offensive actions. And the requirements and what it would take of this, I'm talking at least 500,000 men trained with experience and armed. We're just not seeing this. These developing of high-tech systems. I think the very first system that Ukraine need to develop is fiber optic controlled drones. If we see how many Ukrainian vehicles are getting smashed by those Russian fiber optics, this would be first on my list if we need to have that developed and working. And not only one or two, in massive numbers. What I've said is I believe that only like 10% of Russia's FPV fleet are fiber optics, but that 10% is making up for 90%, if not plus, of successful strikes at the moment. But there's always, and this is, I think, a very Western military industrial complex thinking, just so much focus on R&D, developing new systems, but not having just the quantity of existing systems. There's always looking for a new wonder weapon that, yep, there's going to be this robotic platform or this different UAV or this ground combat system or whatever here, rather than we need to focus on just sheer amount of drones, sheer amount of shells, sheer amount of men. And one thing I will say about this expanding capability that we have seen in Ukraine is there's been a lot of promises fall very short, from medium-range missile tech to some of the other electronic warfare tech to anti-air and air defense technology as well, while the things that are short are bullets, bombs, and men. And, of course, drones and night fighting equipment following on from that. What I want to talk about is this New York Times article talking about Mr. Antony Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State, titled How Antony Blinken, America's Top Diplomat, Became the Secretary of War. Neither side sought negotiations, so Mr. Blinken was less a peacemaker than a war strategist, although there were peace negotiations, we know, in the very beginning. Continue about this. Immersed in details of military hardware and battlefield conditions, he often argued against more risk-adverse Pentagon officials in favour of sending powerful American weapons to Ukraine. And when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mr. Mark A. Riley, suggested in late 2022 that Ukraine should capitalise on battlefield gains by seeking peace talks with Moscow, Mr. Blinken insisted the fight should go on. And in my opinion, and I know this opinion is shared by others, to quote Mr. John Mearsheimer, Professor John Mearsheimer, that was the high water line. So far in territorial gains and amount of leverage on the battlefield, it is looking like late 2022 was the best position to negotiate from a position of power for the situation the Russian military was in at the time. the sanctions kicking in and working, and the manpower that Ukraine had, the morale that Ukraine had, and the amount of aid that was coming in, that was the high waterline. And it is looking like this. And as we have seen from Blinken to Mr. Johnson just harpooning negotiations at points. And I believe, depending on how this ends, but if it ends in an even worse situation than what would have been able to be walked away with at that, they should be, won't be, but they should be held to account for this, because it's very likely that war will end in similar or worse circumstances than 2022. But what have we got? We've had years more of war, hundreds of thousands, if not 500,000 or more dead, and tens, if not hundreds of billions more dollars spent. And the changes, realistically, the changes from that point to this have actually been in Russia's favour, and the situation for Ukraine has deteriorated significantly worse than at that point in time. We know at those points in time, if you believe what some of the big media is reporting out of the Kremlin, that Putin was ready to even make concessions around joining NATO, where we know at this point in time he is not ready to make any concession around that. Visiting Kyiv in May, Mr. Blinken, a guitar player, took the stage at a packed music club and led a local band in rendition of Neil Young's Rockin' in the Free World. The defense of Ukraine had offered him a literal rock star moment. So buttered him up and has made decisions which, in my opinion, a lot of those decisions were made in a lot of egos rather than what is the best for the millions of people involved in this war, suffering every day, not on large government salaries. Anyway, legends. You look after yourself. You have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.